Welcome everyone. I will attempt to simplify the Subtlety Rogue opening rotation for you by using the macros in this video. If you played a Subtlety Rogue in Dragonflight, then you probably realize they have a pretty strict rotation when it comes to getting the most out of their opener and Shadow Dance. While complex, the good thing about having the rotation be so specific is that we can take advantage of a cast sequence macro to make sure we execute the abilities in the exact order we want. To start, what is a cast sequence macro? It is a macro that will cast a list of abilities in a specific order and will progress the next ability every time the macro is clicked. There are a few things you need to keep in mind when making a cast sequence macro. First, the sequence won't continue until it can use the listed abilities in the exact order. So for example, if you put a cooldown ability in the middle of a sequence, if that ability is on cooldown while cycling through the macro, then it will get stuck until it can use that ability. Second, you can only use casted abilities and not something that requires a /use command. Third, you can make the macro reset by using a number of different conditions. I am using a timer with these macros. A reset equals 30 means the macro will reset after 30 seconds from the last time you clicked the macro. If I clicked the macro accidentally at 29 seconds, that would reset the clock and I would need to wait another 30 seconds for it to reset. With that in mind, let's get into how I use cast sequence macros for my Subtlety Rogue. To start, we're in stealth. I like to manually press Shadow Strike to open. I personally don't like having it in the macro, but you can add it if you want. The first macro will cover this section of the opener up to Shadow Dance. This part will cast Shadow Blades, Flagellation, Rupture, and my unused trinket. I'll be able to quickly tell when this macro is complete because the button icon will change to the Shadow Blades cooldown and will get stuck at that point. Once that first macro is complete, I'll pop a Subtlety for the mastery buff. Subtlety doesn't work well with cast sequence macros since it is a /use ability, so you'll have to click it manually. The transition to the second macro is my signal to use it, so it's easy to remember. The second macro will cover the rest of the opening rotation. I slightly altered the rotation and placed Symbols of Death at the end so it won't clip as much time off the Shadow Dance induced Symbols of Death from our two-piece. If you plan on copying this macro, which I'll have in the description, you might want to test it out a couple times, pay attention to the symbols timer, and make adjustments to fit your rogue. And that's it. We turn the long rotation into 3 buttons, Macro 1, Subtlety, and Macro 2. The reason why I split the macro into 2 parts is because Shadow Blades, Flagellation, and my trinket have longer cooldowns, while the cooldowns in the second macro will be ready to use again much sooner. Like I mentioned earlier, for a cast sequence macro to work as intended, you'll need to have all cooldowns you use in the macro to be ready. Since Shadow Dance and Secret Technique will have shorter cooldowns than Cold Blood, if you try to use the same macro again as soon as Shadow Dance and Secret Technique is ready, then it will get stuck at Cold Blood until it can cast it. You don't want to wait around for Cold Blood to be ready, so if you want to still use a macro, then just copy and paste this into a new macro and remove Cold Blood from it. I also remove Vanish from the sequence since each charge is a 2-minute cooldown, and you'll use them up quickly and the macro will get stuck on Vanish once it's on cooldown. The next macro I'll cover is for the AoE rotation. This rotation is slightly modified so it plays nice with cooldowns. I will still manually open with Shadow Strike and then Rupture. Once Rupture is applied, then I drink a Subtlety and start the AoE macro. To make the cooldown timers all get along with each other, I took out Shadow Blades from the rotation, so I have to cast that manually as well. The first 4 finishers in this rotation will depend on Shuriken Tornado's CP generation. Then it will begin alternating between Shuriken Storm and Black Powder. Once you see the cooldown for Shuriken Tornado, then it's time to switch to manual mode. Again, play around with the placement of Symbols of Death in the sequence so that you don't clip the Symbols of Death from Shadow Dance too much. This macro works well with all the cooldowns being 1 minute or less. By the time Shuriken Tornado is back up, then Shadow Dance, Symbols, Cold Blood, and Secret Technique will also be up. The other macro I put together is just for fun doing open world questing. This macro isn't necessary, but I made it more of an example for other times you can make a cast sequence macro. The idea is to have a long enough cast sequence that you will be able to kill most NPCs you'll encounter while doing world quests. It's pretty simple and doesn't use any cooldowns, so there's no time limitations. It'll reset every time combat ends, so it'll be ready to go on the next NPC. Since it begins with Shadow Strike, you'll need to be stealth to start the sequence. There are times where macros can really help you maintain an exact rotation, but they don't work well with every class or spec. If your spec has a specific opening rotation or burst window rotation, then a cast sequence macro might be able to help you optimize those. Now for a warning, the WoW macro system is unable to perform if-then or Boolean logic, so I can't check to see if a buff is up, then use a certain ability. If it could do that, then everyone would be able to automate their entire rotation by spamming one button. For those of you getting ideas, it is a bannable offense to use third-party software or hardware to automate button clicking. I imagine a lot of you are using a gaming mouse that comes with programmable buttons. Clicking one of these buttons to have it execute a list of commands would almost certainly count as a third-party automation program. So explore at your own risk if you're thinking of trying it. And that concludes my Subtlety Rogue macro video. If you enjoyed it, then consider liking and subscribing for more World of Warcraft content. And until next time, take care.